It's time to talk about the last bloodline on our list. Most martial of the bloodlines and easily home of the most terrifying swordsmen in the old world, the blood dragon vampires. Today we're going to talk about the last progenitor, Abhorash, who is also arguably the strongest single individual living in the 8th edition lore. And this is of course highly conjecture, as every race has that strongest fighter in the world moniker attached to them. But let's talk about the founding of this mighty and quote-unquote noble bloodline of vampires. And that whole strongest individual living, I mean, I guess you could say he's undead, but whatever. There's a lot of people that kind of put him on the top 5 strongest lords in the lore. He's there alongside like Tyrion and then like Grimgor and Archaon and such. But in addition, we're also going to talk about the Jade Blooded and the Carrion children, the two lost bloodlines that fled from Lamia after the fall of Nagash. But getting ahead of myself as I usually do, let's dive in on the defender of the Blood Temple or Temple of Blood, Abhorash. So when Neferata ascended to the throne of Lamia, there was one man who stood out from the rest. He was her personal bodyguard as well as captain of the palace guard. Abhorash, even at this time, was known as an incredibly honorable individual as well as a swordsman without equal. And feared and respected across Nehekhara, Abhorash was a fiercely loyal individual. He also had a loyalty or a love for another thing, or another person, you could say. It was Neferata herself. And she was well aware of this, though, and after creating the tainted elixir of life, she used Abhorash's affections against him in a move of manipulation that resulted in him drinking from the chalice. Now, we've already kind of talked about how honor-bound and how kind of virtuous this individual is, but Abhorash is the only character during the birth of vampirism, in this kind of Lamian age of vampirism, that outright hates his disposition. He's disgusted that this kind of is at conflict directly with his honor and his creed, which is really to protect the people of Lamia, not hunt them down in the night. So he's kind of pissed off here. So try as he might, the captain of the Queen's Guard eventually falls victim to his hunger after many months of resisting. In a single night, he tears through 12 hapless human servants of the Queen, bathing in their blood and kind of restoring his strength to 100%. And from this, it kind of it really rattles him to the core. Shaken from his kind of bloody stupor, Abhorash was even more disgusted and resolved to only drink blood from the enemies of Lamia or criminals. So what he does after this too is he lights 12 candles every night in kind of reverence of these people that he kills, and he goes to do this for the rest of his life. And eventually that it takes a different connotation after the fall of Lamia, and it kind of goes to represent his hate towards humanity. But this kind of restraint that he's put him on himself is an important note here. The vampires of Lamia were kind of running all willy-nilly throughout the night, just sucking off anyone they wanted. Abhorash was the only one that tried to kind of curtail that and create an order to the chaos, partly because he knew it would be wrong to prey on the people that they were supposed to protect, but also because he knew it would invite the wrath of the other priest kings. And I mean, we see that this is duplicated out in Morkane with the Strigos Empire, and how actually, I mean, Ashoran, he knew that this was not a bad idea. It was a pretty good idea. And with the fall of Lamia, he kind of realized, oh man, you know what? You know who had it right the whole time? Abhorash, the son of a bitch. He always knows. He always one-upping everyone, Abhorash. That's what I always used to call him. It's a joke, they don't call him that. Initially, the vampires kind of, they heed this warning, but quickly they revert to their old ways, and with it, well, we know what happened there. The priest kings came a-knocking, and Abhorash led the defense of Lamia from the stairs of the Temple of Blood, flanked by his warrior disciples. As the priest kings tried to take the temple, they paid in blood, really. A peerless swordsman as a mortal, Abhorash was a blur of red blades, fangs, and terrifying strength. The lore really talks about the stairs just being awash with blood, pooling at the bottom as the moon kind of dances over the temple, 100 slain in the vampire's wake. And in time, the city eventually fell, and Abhorash took flight with his disciples. And he's extremely angry at this point, and we see this spiral for Abhorash, right? We see him as this kind of noble, virtuous palace guard, or someone who's really willing to defend his monarch to the last. And he turns this individual who kind of becomes very disenchanted with humanity, with rule, and his own race. Unlike the rest of the vampires, he did not join Nagash. He was pretty pissed, like I was saying. He had sworn to never hurt an innocent human, but now he was so fed up with humanity, as well as the rest of his race, humanity for destroying everything he cherished and protected, the Priest Kings, and then his race for abandoning Lamia rather than fighting. So off he went, accompanied by his closest vamp bros. And shortly after this, Nagash curses all of vampires, all of vampirism, all the vampire race, whatever, to no longer be allowed in the sun. And all the other kind of bullshit weaknesses that vampires have. You can't cross running water, you'll be afraid of garlic, all that kind of stuff. But this didn't really deter our exiled vampire lord. Abhorash went about instilling strong discipline, honor, and a credo into his followers. Never drink the blood of an unworthy opponent was rule number 1. Rule number 2, there's always honor in combat. Never be deceitful, never be full of skullduggery. And then another rule is, and that the true measure of anyone's strength is only discovered in the fury of a one-on-one duel. And it's implied that Wallach Harkin and Varys the Blade were amongst his original and closest vampires. So, traveling the world, Abhorash challenged greenskins, chaos champions, pre-empire human tribal warlords, all manner of the most skilled warriors. And all of them really fell before his blade, only turning the most impressive and promising of his duelists. This is a time before the Empire. This is a time before the unification of Bretonnia under Gilles Le Breton. So very early in the lore of the old world. In fact, it's so hard to. It's almost like taking a look at the actual ancient Egyptian timeline, right? Where you look at how what's that, like the BS fact of we live closer to. Or the dinosaurs lived closer to the production of the creation of the pyramids than we do. Something like that. Like the creation of, or the timeline of Nehekhara is so far behind, or so far back from the early empire, the old world, the unification of Bretonnia, that it's kind of hard to think that there's this whole huge span of time that happens up to that point. So, and even before that, the Great Catastrophe, and the fall of the High Elves and the Dwarfs. I mean, all this shit has actually happened so far back in history that it's kind of hard to kind of put that into perspective. But this is, again, pre that time. And this is before he creates the Red Duke, who is, again, another one of his, spawn that is extremely strong. But eventually Abhorash hears of a beast at the top of a giant mountain in the World's Edge Mountains. Now, the lore describes this as the mountain itself as a mighty peak whose summit is wreathed in fire and smoke. And I'm going to have to assume that this is one of the 3 volcanoes in the World's Edge Mountains. Fire Mountain, which is as creative as a name as you can think of. Thunder Mountain, which is also a ride at Disneyland. Or Red Cloud Mountain, which sounds like a really weird drink at a really shitty bar. And there's never been a lot of fleshing out of the lore on the subject, and 6th edition is really the height of Abhorash's presence in Warhammer Fantasy. I mean, after this, the Bloodlines kind of get homogenized into the 7th edition, and we hear tales from that of Abhorash in the 7th edition. In 8th edition, they completely wipe out the Bloodline, like actual differences. It talks about their lores and such, but it doesn't really give them any connotation in the actual rules. So 6th edition is, again, that height. Abhorash isn't really huge after this point. And ascending to the mountain, Abhorash finds the lair of an ancient red dragon and decides he's going to go toe-to-toe with it. Drawing his sword, the two fight for the entire night. The dragon, unable to kill the Lord of the Night, as Abhorash scores more and more gashes into the monster's hide. And eventually, Abhorash pierces the dragon's heart, and before it can fully die, he drinks deep the dragon's lifeblood. And the result is a being of immense strength. Tossing the dragon's body from the mountain, he lets out a triumphant, blood-curdling shout. Abhorash has now defeated the curse of vampirism. Need to crave on blood has totally left him, yet he retains all the strength he once had. Able to walk in the daylight, he has set out what he tried to accomplish. Regain his honor. And it is done with this kind of act here. He sort of charges the rest of his disciples to do the same as he did. Go out into the world, hone their skills to a level that they feel they can defeat their vampirism. And this spawns the long-spanning lineage of the blood dragons, or the Ordo Draconis, taking on the insignia of a red dragon emblazoned on their shields. These are the warriors that guard bridges, mountain passes, old keeps, just kind of seeking worthy duels with those they deem, well, worthy. And where better to find such men? Bretonia. And there's no wonder that a majority of the order hails from a land known equally for its code of honor as well as its martial skill. But we can't well talk about blood dragons without talking about the Blood Keep. Wallach Harkin eventually creates his own coven in the Blood Keep, which is located in the passageways, I guess you could say mountain passes, through from the Empire to Bretonia. This would be around the Helmgart area near Weisenland if you wanted to look at it on the Total War Warhammer map. It's not actually on that map. But he goes to this keep. He basically goes through each and every one of the knights, killing them, and the ones that he feels perform very well, he retains as actual blood dragon vampires and converts them, and then the rest of them all convert all the servants and the thralls and squires of the keep itself. So he basically turns this entire order, which in the later lore is actually called the Order. The later lore calls it it's an order of knights, of Sigmar knights. So it implies that it's a Templar order called the Order of the Blood Dragons, which is not the case in the earlier lore. I promise, guys, the Blood Dragons, Order of the Blood Dragons, and Blood Knights references all get so muddled up and fucked up through the lore, it's hard for me to even tell you guys how it works as someone who's read it every single edition gone, wait, what? So, over time, though, an army led by one of Van Hel's distant relatives lays siege to the keep in a 3-year-long siege that ultimately sees the Haven of the Blood Knights destroyed. And it talks about in the lore how, they're starting to see people kind of coming back to the keep over time, or there's people that have been marauding through the forests, just like the people or the members of the Blood Knights of the Blood Keep used to do. Originally, this is where the term Blood Knight came from, a blood dragon from the Blood Keep, but it has grown to become synonymous with blood dragons as a whole. I guess the best way of looking at this is, not all blood dragons are blood knights. All blood knights are blood dragons, if that statement makes sense. So I'm saying anyone who is a blood knight is a blood dragon vampire who hails from the Blood Keep. All blood dragon vampires are not blood knights because they don't all come from the Blood Keep. There is a thorough explanation. So we have this very long and wide-sweeping history with Abhorash, right? In the end times, Abhorash honors a promise that he made to Gilles Le Breton and assists him as the world kind of is swallowed into oblivion. It's just him, Abhorash, and the remainder of his blood dragon vampires, with Gilles Le Breton and the remainder of his Grail Knights just kind of fighting off and defending this last bastion. And that's really the last we see of the blood dragon Primarch, as it were. It's rumored that he's going to be coming back in the Age of Sigmar, and if that happens, boom, open a shut case, I'll start playing immediately. But the blood dragons are feared throughout the old world, and in tabletop, you can make a lord that was just absolutely disgusting, called a quote-unquote blender lord. And Total War has kind of recreated that with the new blood dragon lord from the new Bloodlines added with the Curse of the Vampire Coast. What we're going to do right now is go over those the abilities, the bloodline abilities for the blood dragon. So if you become a blood dragon, you get 2 increased to your weapon skill, you get a bunch more armor, and they have high leadership. So, that's that. But the 2 weapon skill thing is huge. We're going to go back to that. Vampire lords could take 100 points of abilities. Vampire thralls, or not lords, basically the hero version thus of, could have 50 points of abilities. So the blood dragons have all these abilities, and I'm going to explain. This is me explaining the Blender Lord in a very long, sweeping form. Red Fury, which we've already seen in Total War Warhammer. It's always been the end of the personal yellow line. The vampire enters the melee as he has always done in centuries past, with a savage and unstoppable bloodlust. He won't stop until all his enemies lie dead on the ground. This gives the vampire an additional attack. We see it, of course, giving melee attack bonuses in Total War Warhammer. Blade Master. Trained by the best swordsmen of different periods and cultures, a blood dragon vampire can easily deflect the blows from his puny enemy. This one's really cool because it basically, anytime the blood dragon vampire gets into attacks with things, it has a chance to basically they lose an attack when they fight him. So it can outright negates some of the damage coming towards him. Heart piercing, which again we see in Total War Warhammer. Using a combination of great strength and amazing speed, it is easy for the vampire to create a gap in his opponent's guard. And basically the vampire can re-roll missed close combat attacks in the first round of every combat. Now we see this included in Total War Warhammer as an activatable ability that you get through the skill line that increases certain attributes. I believe it was weapon strength and AP. I can't remember off the top of my head. Master Strike. So strong is the Lord of the Night that a well-placed blow from his sword can sever a limb or decapitate the toughest opponents. The vampire has the Killing Blow special rule, which we know in tabletop can outright kill someone if it rolls a 6. Strength of Steel, such as the vampire's martial prowess that he is able to strike at this precise moment when it will cause the most carnage. This increases his strength by 1. Strength of Steel we also see in Total War Warhammer. It is, again, it confers the same kind of bonuses or increases weapon strength attack and as such. Lastly, Honor or Death. Many mortal champions forget their rash pride after the valiant challenges they issued is accepted by a creature whose eyes are the eyes of death itself. This basically has to do with the challenge mechanic of tabletop. In Total War Warhammer, we see Honor or Death taken as well. We also see Ordo Draconis. So we see a lot of ways that the Blood Dragon vampires echo this sentiment that the Blood Dragons are these masters of the Blood Knights. You know, these guys are these lords that would bring Blood Knights to their banner, or people that would bring Graveguard up into plenty because, you know, Graveguard are very elite whites, kind of like whites. Versions of the vampire counts, and you see that reflected in Total War Warhammer. These guys have a huge reduction to the upkeep, the cost, the recruitment time, blah blah blah, of Blood Knights and Graveguards through their talent trees. So the Blood Dragon Vampire, if you were to take it as your lord, you get 2 weapon skill, and if you take the right abilities, you get 1 attack, you get 1 strength, all that kind of good stuff. So if I take a look at the actual stat profile of a vampire, as I struggle to look for it. So Vampire Lord by default has 8 weapon skill. A Blood Dragon Vampire Lord by default then has 10 weapon skill, making him the highest weapon skill in the game, next to, I think it's a Blood Dragon Demon. That's not the right thing I'm thinking of a Khorne Greater Demon, which I think has a 9 or a 10. I can't remember off the top of my head. Their strength naturally is 5. This increases to 6. And they have attacks of 5, which increases to 6 if you take the right abilities. And furthermore, you're supposed to take certain magic items that make it so this lord is just disgusting. But this gives you an idea. You used to be able to take this guy, put him on foot, and put him into a unit of Graveguard or just a unit of anything for the most part, and he would just completely wreck house. It was so fun to use this character because it was a pretty expensive character. It was like base cost was 285 points. But it would increase as you would take more and more abilities and such. But it was just absolutely fearsome. If you put it in a unit, it couldn't be soloed out. And if it was in a unit, it could use a Watch Out Sir to absorb some damage. So basically you had this, not near impervious, but a very, very strong lord that could just completely decimate anything it touched. There are not very many lords, even special characters, that can touch a generic Blood Dragon Vampire Lord in the tabletop. And honestly, I see that translated almost directly into Total War Warhammer. That Blood Dragon Vampire on a zombie can kill Kolek, can kill what's his name? The new guy, the Kraken Lord, got up on the top, Lokir Felhard. He can kill almost any of the tankier lords pretty easily. I have not really tested him against dwarfs, to be totally honest, but he is a very disgusting lord nonetheless. And I love that. It really plays heavily into the lore behind the Blood Dragons. But that kind of puts a closure on our bloodlines. But what are the lost bloodlines, though? And there were 2. The Jade Blooded and the Mot-Masi, or the Carrion Children, as we've already discussed. So the Jade Blooded, the progenitor of the Jade Blooded was Harakti, the Chief Justice and High Executioner of Lamia. And before he became a vampire, Harakti was an immeasurably old human who would resort to magic and drugs to prolong his life further. And when he became a vampire, he was a frail, kind of old thing still. You know, I just think this very gaunt individual, long, spindly fingers and nails, kind of taking on the attributes of a Necroc vampire, but more just an old human being that just looks, hey, you know, man, If someone farts, you might die. But like that kind of thing. So he passes that on, that ailment, I guess you could say, to each member of his bloodline as he kind of converts them. And before the Priest Kings besieged Lamia, Rakati took 12 of his closest servants, turned them into vampires, and headed down the Silk Road into Cathay. And each member of the bloodline has cloudy eyes, much like cataracts, I guess you could say. Or I guess the eyes that Manfred has in any of the Total War Warhammer cinematics, but that's neither here nor there. Translucent skin and bright green blood, which of course gives the bloodline its name, Jade Blooded. Now Rakati then sets up a vast spy network in Cathay, supplanting power and placing his vampires in important roles throughout the kingdom. When Cathay eventually fractured into a bunch of like separate kingdom nations and such, the vampires started to turn on each other, and a lot of them started to wage war against Rakati, and he kills 4 of them outright. But the rest, they kind of actually remain as the rulers of the different portions of Cathay, instilling puppet emperors and rulers in their stead, and ruling from the shadows, which is a really awesome kind of portion of Catherine's lore. Cathay's lore is that basically you have Cathay ruled almost entirely by vampires, if you think about it in the way that context is. Now, this is only in Warhammer Fantasy RPG Night's Dark Master. These two are not referenced anywhere else in the lore. Anywhere else. The only other reference is just that they existed. In the 6th edition, it says that there were 9 vampire lords, there was 12 vampire lords, and only 7 of them lived to the end of Lamia, and 2 went north and east. Or 1 went north, 1 went east. The other 5 went to the old world. That's as far as we know from the official 6th, 7th, and 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Vampire Counts books. So this is only in Warhammer Fantasy RPG, and it's not anything else outside of that. Now, the other bloodline is a bit different. Motmesis, the Grand Chancellor and Vizier of Lamia, was turned into a vampire by Neferata, with the role of maintaining the household and the treasury of the kingdom. Now, Motmesis instead spent all of the money he could growing fat, as well as having sex with just about every servant he could. I don't know why it is that every time I hear the word vizier, I just think of just a fat slob. So it fits so well into this kind of role. So when Vashanesh, or Vlad von Karstein as you know him, found out about this, Motmesis fled from the city. Rife with kind of as paranoia and fear, he lost his mind as he trudges west through the great Arabian desert, and eventually he succumbed to his madness and collapsed on the sand. Over time, though, these insects started to eat at him. The wind and sand blasted his skin away, and his body became more and more insect than it did vampire and sand, because he's basically he's got no skin to really regenerate at this point, because it's just constantly being eaten away or just kind of blasted off. And over time, he resembles something part sand, part insect, and part vampire. And turning a nomadic tribe of Arabians into vampires, they grew to kind of become strong and proficient assassins, vying for mass amounts of wealth as kind of a personal amusement. That's I guess you could say the crux of this bloodline, is that they're all about assassination and just mass accumulations of wealth, like basically like dragon vampires. But Motmesis becomes Motmasa, or Child of Death, and now he lives in a cave deep in the desert, turning slowly into an insect that he rules over the bloodline in secrecy from, or as. Fucking scary. So that kind of puts a nail in it, guys. That's the end of our foray into the bloodlines. I hope you enjoyed each and every one of these videos as we talked about the ins and outs of our bloodlines. I know it is, again, very confusing to kind of get a really good grasp on this. You can imagine what it's like for me. Abhorash is my absolute favorite character in the lore, next to Anarian. They are my two chief. Like, people always ask me, well, who's your favorite lord? Who's my favorite race? My favorite race will always be High Elves. My favorite lords will always be Abhorash and Anarian. They are always the coolest lords to me, and I love it's because they come from this honorable stance, and they see that honor in the end of the day can only get you so far, and there always is a way to redeem yourself, even in the face of all this kind of adversity and all this kind of corruption that you're placed into. And that's why I really like Abhorash, is because he has a really good character arc, and he's barely in the goddamn lore. You look at other characters like Grimgor, who just like headbutts and like dick kicks his way through history, and you're like, a little more one-dimensional for me. So, Abhorash, you know, we do see him in and out throughout the lore. He comes and goes. He's a bit of a Jedi wanderer. He creates the Red Duke well after the fact that he is cured from vampirism. He can still clearly transfer his vampirism to people who don't take on his attribute to defeat it. You know, basically, what I'm trying to say in the most muddled way possible is, if Abhorash today were to make a vampire, the vampire still has to go find a way to get rid of his thirst for blood, the hunger as it's called. So again, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this here today. Don't forget to check out Patreon. Go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, all that action. We will be doing a stream of Celestia Direfin on Twitch here today. That'll be starting at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so be on the lookout for that. But as always, guys, thanks for watching. Have a good one, and take care.